She had the letter in her glove. She had rehearsed every word of what she meant to say. She had not rehearsed what to do if he already knew why she'd gwang. Before she said a single one of them, the coach let her down at the gatehouse, and Caroline Pierce walked the last half-mile to Thornfield Court on foot, because she did not want the sound of wheels on the drive announcing her before she was ready to be announced. She wanted to arrive quietly, hand him the letter, and be gone again, before anyone in that house had time to ask her a single question she didn't. 19's fared. Let him have a steady enough voice to answer. The letter was a small, folded weight in her glove, carried for 9 days, taken out exactly 3 times in that span, and put away again each time without finishing the second line. The afternoon was the color of dishwater. Hard frost had come the night before, and not yet lifted, and the long avenue of elms stood rimed white and silent on either side of the drive. Thornfield rose ahead of her, gray stone against a grayer sky, a house she had visited perhaps a dozen times in the 8 months since her engagement to its master had been quietly settled between 2 families who needed, rather more than they needed, affection, a sensible arrangement that solved a great many practical problems at once. She had always gone in by the side door before, the steward's door, the one used by anyone who came on business rather than as an honored guest, because that was closer to what she had actually been at Thornfield. Not quite a guest, not quite anything the betrothal contract claimed, simply a quiet, useful woman who had spent 8 months managing correspondence and household accounts for a man too occupied with his shipping interests to manage either properly himself. The arrangement had been settled the way such arrangements often were between families with more name than money. Her own father, a country solicitor of modest means, had handled some delicate legal business for Edmund's late uncle, and the connection, once made, had been quietly leveraged by both families into a sensible match. Edmund needed a wife with a clear head for figures and no expensive taste for society. Caroline's family needed the considerable relief a Thornfield connection would bring to their own narrowing fortunes. Neither family had troubled themselves overmuch with whether either party actually wanted the arrangement beyond its evident good sense, and Caroline, 24 and practical by both nature and necessity, had told herself that good sense was a perfectly adequate foundation to build a marriage on. Whatever the novels she'd once read as a girl had promised about love arriving differently. She went toward the side door now, from old habit, and she stopped, and turned, and walked instead to the front. That was the first thing she did differently, a small thing. She had decided, somewhere on the long cold walk up the drive, that if she meant to end this, she would end it standing properly at the front of the house, not slipping away through the seam of it the way she had slipped through every other room at Thornfield for 8 quiet months. She lifted the brass knocker and let it fall, twice, and waited while the sound traveled into the house and came back to her as silence. It was Mrs. Hale who opened the door. Housekeeper at Thornfield for some 15 years, a tall, spare woman with gray hair pinned so severely it looked carved rather than dressed, and a habit of studying a visitor a beat longer than was entirely comfortable before she spoke. She studied Caroline now, in exactly that way. Something moved behind her eyes that Caroline could not immediately name. Miss Pierce, Mrs. Hale, I've come to see Lord Ashby. I won't keep him long. He is expecting you. Caroline had braced herself for a great many answers on the long walk up that drive. She had not braced for that one. The words landed like cold water down the back of her collar. She had told no one she was coming, written no letter ahead, sent no word. The whole small architecture of her plan had depended entirely on surprise, on arriving and saying her piece before anyone had the chance to arrange a scene, or a defense, or a speech designed to talk her out of what she'd already decided. Here stood the housekeeper, holding the door wide, as though Caroline were simply late for an appointment she'd forgotten making. I think there's some mistake, Caroline said. You can't be expecting me. There's no mistake, miss. Mrs. Hale stepped back to let her pass. Come in, out of the cold. You're wanted in the study. What Caroline did not know, crossing that threshold was that Lord Edmund Ashby had received a letter 4 days earlier, accusing her of theft, and had spent every hour since trying to discover who had written it, and why, and how to undo whatever damage it had already done before she ever learned the accusation existed. The study door stood closed when Mrs. Hale led her to it, and opened only once the housekeeper had knocked and been answered, low, from somewhere within. Edmund Ashby stood at the window when Caroline entered, his back to the room, a tall, severe figure against the gray afternoon light. He turned only once the door had clicked shut behind her, and what struck her first, before anything either of them said, was how little sleep seemed to have touched him in whatever days had passed since she'd Astards. A thing stood in this room. He had been her employer in the strictest sense, and her betrothed in the strangest one for 8 months. And in all that time she had heard him laugh exactly once, something a stable boy had said, in passing, and had watched him catch himself almost immediately afterward, as though laughing were a lapse he hadn't meant to permit himself. He crossed the room now, and turned the key in the study door, quiet and deliberate, and slid it into his waistcoat pocket, before she had fully registered what he'd done. "You've locked the door," she said. "I have. I'd ask you to unlock it." His voice, when it came, was carefully level, particular levelness of a man holding something considerably less level just beneath it. "I won't keep you here against your will, Miss Pierce. You have my word on that, plainly given. But I'm asking you for a quarter of an hour before you go anywhere at all. And I've locked the door because I believe, if I don't, you'll be gone before I've finished my first sentence. And I find I can't let that happen. Not today, not with what I've learned these past 4 days. You don't know why I've come. I believe I do. I received a letter 4 days ago, unsigned, accusing you of taking household funds meant for the tenant relief account, nearly £200 across several months. The figures arranged carefully enough, too, look exactly like the kind of theft a trusted woman might commit if she believed nobody troubled to check her books closely. He held her gaze steadily. "I do not believe a word of it, Miss Pierce. I have spent 4 days proving I don't believe it. And I find I'd rather show you what I meant and let you walk out that door still believing whatever drove you here today." Caroline stood very still, the letter in her glove suddenly a far smaller, far less significant thing than she'd carried it up the drive, believing it to be. "I came to return your ring. I assumed, when Mrs. Cleese Hale's note reached me 3 days ago, asking that I attend the steward's accounts review in person, that the matter had already been settled against me, and that you'd simply summoned me to hear the verdict read aloud, rather than risk a scandal by simply dismissing me by letter. There is no verdict against you. There was never going to be one. Once I'd had a single afternoon with the actual ledgers. Something in his expression had gone raw in a way she had never once seen from him in 8 careful months. "Sit, if you'd rather, or stand if you can't bear to sit just now. Hear me out, Caroline, before you decide anything further about what kind of man you've spent 8 months engaged to." He laid the ledgers out across the desk between them, page by careful page, the household accounts she herself had kept meticulously for 8 months, set beside a second set of figures, nearly identical at a glance, subtly altered in a dozen small places that wouldn't she who, unavlick, had caught an inattentive eye, but had caught his, once he'd known to look properly. "Someone copied your hand," he said, closely enough to fool a steward who wasn't looking carefully, not closely enough to fool me. Once I set the 2 sets of figures side by side and traced every discrepancy back to its source. Who would do such a thing? My own cousin, Tobias, as it happens, who stands to inherit a considerable portion of this estate, should our engagement dissolve under sufficiently scandalous circumstances, and who has, I now understand, been quietly diverting funds of his own for the better part of a year, and needed a convenient name to attach the blame to before anyone thought to look at his cry instead of yours. Caroline sat slowly in the chair across from the desk, the cold of the long walk finally catching up with her now that the fear that had driven it had begun, cautiously, to ease. "You're certain I'm entirely certain. Confronted him 2 days ago, with the discrepancies laid plain in front of him. He confessed within the quarter hour, rather less skilled at maintaining a lie under direct pressure than he was at constructing one on paper. Edmund's jaw tightened. He leaves Thornfield by week's end, and will not return to it while I have any say in the matter, which I intend to have for a very long while yet. And why lock the door at all, if the matter's already settled? Because I did not want you walking into this room believing you been summoned to hear a verdict against you, and walking back out of it the moment the truth was offered. Too relieved at simply being cleared to ask me the harder question underneath it. He came around the desk, standing closer now than careful courtesy had ever quite permitted him to stand in 8 months of careful distance. You came here today, prepared to leave me, Caroline, not merely prepared to defend yourself against a false accusation, prepared to end the whole engagement. I'd like to know why, and I'd rather hear it honestly than let you walk out that door without ever asking. But first, she wanted the whole of how he'd found it. The not knowing had cost her 9 sleepless nights already, and she found she could not move past the fear of the accusation until she understood, in plain detail, exactly how thin the thread had been that had nearly ruined her. "Show me," she said, properly. "I want to understand how close I came to losing everything over a stranger's forged hand." Edmund drew the second set of ledgers closer, tracing one careful finger down a column of figures. It began with the tenant relief disbursements for March. 2 entries, each for £11, recorded a week apart, in what looked at a glance exactly like your hand. I might have missed it entirely, except that you've a particular habit, Caroline, of crossing your 7s with a small flourish at the top stroke. Whoever forged these entries didn't know to copy it. Once I'd noticed that single missing flourish, I went back through every page of the past year, looking for it, and found 4 more entries missing the same small mark, each one diverting a modest sum toward an account I didn't recognize. Whose account? A solicitor's office in the county town, ostensibly handling estate business on Tobias's behalf, though the sums involved had nothing to do with any legitimate estate matter I could find recorded. I wrote out myself 2 days ago and put the question to the solicitor directly. He was not eager to answer until I made plain that obstruction would cost him his license, rather more swiftly than honesty would cost his client. Edmund's mouth tightened. Tobias had been borrowing against an inheritance he doesn't actually hold yet, using funds skimmed from the tenant accounts to cover gambling debts he didn't hold. I want our family solicitor discovering through the usual channels. He needed a name to attach the blame to, should anyone ever look closely enough to notice the missing sums. Yours was convenient. You manage the books. You're new enough to the family that nobody would think twice about a marriage dissolving over a scandal, however manufactured. And if you hadn't noticed the 7s, then I expect you'd have been gone from this house and this engagement within the week. And Tobias would have inherited everything he'd spent the better part of a year quietly maneuvering toward, with considerably less scrutiny than an honest theft might have drawn. Edmund's voice had gone low and hard. I do not forgive easily, Caroline, and I will not forgive this easily either, whatever else comes of today. Caroline sat with the whole of it a long moment, the fire settling lower in the grate, the fear that had carried her up that cold drive finally beginning, properly, to loosen its grip. Caroline was quiet a long while, the fire settling low in the grate, the gray afternoon light gone thin and pale through the tall windows. 8 months, Edmund, and I have never once heard you say anything to me that wasn't strictly necessary. I manage your correspondence. I manage your household accounts. I sit across from you at dinner, 3 evenings a week, and we discuss shipping tariffs and tenant repairs, and I have begun to wonder whether the whole engagement is simply a sensible arrangement and have made with any competent woman willing to sign the contract, and whether I am, to you, considerably more replaceable than I had once hoped to be. I locked a door today and told a housekeeper to summon you under false pretense, rather than risk losing the chance to say a single honest word to you, Because the alternative was watching you walk away, believing exactly that. His voice had roughened, the careful control she'd known him by, for 8 months, cracking, properly open, for what she suspected, was the first time, in considerably longer than their engagement had lasted. I do not say things that aren't strictly necessary, Caroline, because I learned a long while ago, watching my own father say a great many unnecessary, careless things to my mother, that he didn't mean, and couldn't take back, that words spent too freely lose their weight. I have been careful with mine for so long, that I find I no longer know how to spend them properly, even when the moment plainly calls for it. I am asking you, now, however badly I manage the asking, to stay, not because the engagement is sensible, because I find, watching you stand in that doorway, with my ring in your glove, that I would rather lose every sensible arrangement this house has ever made, than lose you over my own failure to say so before today. Caroline did not answer immediately. The fire popped once, low, in the long silence that followed, and somewhere beyond the study window, the first thin rain of evening had begun, light against the gravel drive. That is considerably more than I expected to hear today, Edmund. I find it's considerably more than I expected to say. I'd rather say it badly than not say it at all, having come this close to losing the chance entirely. She rose slowly from the chair, the letter still folded in her glove, and crossed to where he stood, and found, when she finally answered him, that the ring she'd carried up that long, cold drive to return had no need, after all, of ever leaving her hand again. "Unlock the door, then," she said softly. "Not because I mean to leave through it, because I'd rather stay in this room, today, of my own choosing, than have you believe you ever needed to lock me into anything at all." He unlocked it, and in the years that followed, in that house, in that marriage, the study door never once needed locking again.